evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepytimetales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, most podcasts put their promotion and rattling of cups halfway through or even towards the end. But because if all goes well, you'll be asleep long before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. The show is brought to you by the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from more people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund the show, to keep it going, and to help me reach new audiences are much appreciated. So if you're making use of Sleepytimetales regularly, whether nightly or a couple of times a week, to help you to deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales, or go to the link in the show notes or from the website to take a look at what's on offer. You'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards available from as little as $2 a month. From early release of the weekly episodes to weekly bonus episodes and special edits of the main show, there's something for pretty much any contribution level. If supporting every month seems like a little bit much of a commitment and you're not too sure about it, there are other methods available though. Besides the Patreon, there's the tip jar, the merchandise store, and even others. But another huge way to help is to simply tell people. If there is someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepytimetales, just let them know. Spreading the word to new potential listeners and insomniacs who I might be able to reach help me reach more people every week. And of course, if you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I know and I can thank you. The tag is @Sleepytimetales on Instagram or Twitter. Last thing, of course, is I need to shout out the music, which is, as always, is Undesirbar Kumiku. The music is available on the Free Music Archive, and I've linked the website in the show notes as they've got some very cool stuff that they release under various names that I recommend checking out. Thank you for taking the time, and let's get back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepytimetales? What is this thing for? This strange idea, this podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to? But while it sounds odd, the fact is a lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find you just can't quite doze back off again at 3 a.m? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. Now, I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. I gave my parents sleepless nights for many years, and even once I got old enough not to be a bother to them anymore, sleep really was always a struggle for me. A lot of people I knew liked sleeping with the TV or the radio on, but I resisted because I thought I preferred silence. But one night when I discovered if I tried to listen to podcasts with droning voices, there was actually a tendency for those to act almost like a sedative for me. They didn't have the light that would disturb me on the TV or the music or ads of the radio. Just voices, maybe with a little bit of low-level theme music and a topic that would keep me focused, but not so focused that when sleep crept up on me, I was gone. Now, every episode of this show starts with this same intro because it serves a couple of important purposes. For new listeners to the show, I need to sort of make a case for it, which is what I've been doing so far, and explain to you why I think it may be helpful and how I think it's helpful to engage with it. But older listeners have found a use for it as well. Because in a way, it's kind of like a guided meditation. Because I do the same thing over and over again, more or less. I do re-record it every week, otherwise I would just be able to do it a lot faster. But I try to keep it a little bit different, but broadly similar, so that it's very familiar to long-time listeners. So when they hit play and they start listening, they sort of start preparing themselves almost automatically for sleep, to prepare themselves in their space. That this may be as useful to listen to while you're brushing your teeth and having a drink of water and getting yourself ready, or maybe even once you're curled up, and just allow the familiar rhythm of it to help you to allow sleep to come for you. Because what we're doing here together is we're building a space together, a nest or a cave or a cabin in the woods, something for you to be comfortable in, to settle into. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with the show. If you have something different, feel free to please let me know, because I would love to pass any advice on to listeners. But for me, when I listen to something, I need something to actually focus on. Like those early podcasts that I used to listen to, usually about video games or movies or something like that. Something that I was actually interested in, something to focus on, so that when stress or anxiety came for me, it didn't find a purchase. Because that's the one thing that usually does keep me awake, is worrying about the future and stress. And if I keep that sort of wolf at bay, then sleep can come creeping up. I need something to focus on, just enough not to resist sleep when it comes for me. Some people might need something a little bit different, a little bit more primal. White noise apps and that sort of thing are quite big in these days. Background noise to help people sleep. There are whole channels on YouTube with the sound of rain or the sound of wind or the ocean. But maybe for you, some dude just droning on in the background is really the key for you. Some droning baritone instead of the sea or the sun or rain. Tonight's story that I'm gonna try use to focus your mind is a return to the secret garden. I did the first section of this a couple of months ago, and I'm going to be returning to it. One thing about this is when you're doing a lot of 19th century stories, you start realizing how endemic racism is and stuff. I tried to edit some of the worst of it out, but there is a little bit of stuff that people of Indian extraction might not be comfortable with. Ultimately, I softened some of it, but ultimately left it in because I felt it was more of a reflection of the people doing the speaking than the people they're speaking about, or even of me. But I do want to warn you that maybe there's something there that may be a bit uncomfortable. But this is a classic story of Western literature, apparently, so we'll soldier on for tonight. But as you listen to the story, whatever the topic is, and if it sometimes gets a little bit uncomfortable, and I hope it doesn't, but I just try to be sensitive to the needs of people, what's really important is that you don't force sleep. You need to keep a light mental grip on the thread of the tale and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you'll sleep before I get to the end of the episode, but it's very important you don't feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night. In fact, it very likely won't. Odds are it'll take at least 2 or 3 nights for it really to start working for you. You might need to get over the sense of the strangeness of it, this listening to some strange guy talking to you in your sleep. It does sound a bit odd, and you don't really know you can trust me until you've had a good listen, to be honest. Although you can, I'm always going to look after you. I'll even warn you, give you the most content warnings over the most minor potential things, just in case, because I don't want you to be uncomfortable in any way. It's also possible my accent's a bit strange to you. It's a bit of an unusual one. And it's also possible that one episode just isn't long enough, so queue up a few. In fact, my main problem with me struggling to sleep lately is not so much the going to sleep. It's the fact that I wake up at about 3 a.m. most mornings, and sometimes I find myself having been lying half asleep for hours without even realizing what I was doing. So mitigate with that, what I do is I queue up a few episodes of what I'm listening to. I download a bunch and have them ready to go, and then I start usually on the latest episode, and I let them run with my earbuds in and just fall asleep. When I inevitably wake up at 3 or 3:30 in the morning, I just pop those earbuds back in, and there I go again, right back to sleep. Sometimes even I wake up a little bit before my alarm. Sometimes 30 minutes or 60 minutes before my alarm goes. I usually set it for 6 a.m. and I find myself awake at 5:30. And I do exactly the same thing. I used to lie awake and get annoyed with myself, but then I realized if I just pop the earbuds in, I can go back to sleep. And strangely enough, sometimes that 30 minutes or 60 minutes can be the absolute best part of my night. I'm not 100% sure why, but I think maybe there's just sort of the psychological effect of allowing yourself deep relaxation right before the alarm is just invigorating in a whole different way. But it's very important that if you're going to sleep or you've woken up or your alarm's imminent and you just want to get a few more winks in, it's very important that you try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange to you, so I request that you give it a chance. As I said, give it a solid 2 or 3 nights just to see how it goes, and if it doesn't go for you, then there are other options out there that I hope you can find help. Because that's what it's all about. I don't want to force you to listen to me, but I definitely do think I can help a certain amount of people, and I hear from enough to suggest that is true. And that's the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I'll tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way, or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way, to help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well-rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. And I really need you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears, trying to help. Frustration is one of the great enemies of a good night's sleep. And the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep and to a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we'll try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life, and progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. This week, we return to The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 4. Martha. When she opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire, and was kneeling on the hearth rug, shaking out the cinders noisily. Mary lay and watched her for a few moments and then began to look about the room. She had never seen a room at all like it and thought it curious and gloomy. The walls were covered with tapestry with a forest scene embroidered on it. There were fantastically dressed people under the trees, and in the distance there was a glimpse of the turrets of a castle. There were hunters and horses and dogs and ladies. Mary felt as if she were in a forest with them. Out of a deep window she could see a great climbing stretch of land, which seemed to have no trees on it, and to look rather like an endless, dull, purplish sea. "What is that?" she said, pointing out of the window. Martha, the young housemaid, who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there?" she said. "Yes, that's the moor," with a good-natured grin. "Does thee like it?" "No," answered Mary. "I hate it." "That's because thou art not used to it," Martha said, going back to her hearth. "Thou thinks it's too big and bare now, but thou will like it." "Do you?" inquired Mary. "Aye, that I do," answered Martha, cheerfully polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's none bare. It's covered with growing things and it smells sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer when the gorse and broom and heather's in flower. It smells of honey and there's a lot of fresh air, and the sky looks so high, and the bees and skylarks make such a nice noise humming and singing. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary listened to her with a grave, puzzled expression. The native servants she had been used to in India were not in the least like this. They were obsequious and servile and did not presume to talk to their masters as if they were their equals. They made salams and called them protector of the poor and names of that sort. Indian servants were commanded to do things, not asked. It was not the custom to say please and thank you, and Mary had always slapped her Aya in the face when she was angry. She wondered a little what this girl would do if one slapped her in the face. She was a round, rosy, good-natured-looking creature, but she had a sturdy way which made Mistress Mary wonder if she might not even slap back, if the person who slapped her was only a little girl. "You are a strange servant," she said from her pillows, rather haughtily. Martha sat up on her heels with her blacking brush in her hand and laughed, without seeming the least out of temper. I know that," she said. "If there was ever a grand missus at Misselthwaite, I should never have been one of the under-housemaids. I might have been let to be scullery maid, but I'd never have been let upstairs. I'm too common and I talk too much Yorkshire. But this is a funny house for all it's so grand. Seems like there's neither master nor mistress except Mr. Pitcher and Mrs. Medlock. Mr. Craven, he won't be troubled about anything when he's there, and he's nearly always away. Mrs. Medlock gave me the place out of kindness. She told me she could never have done it if Misselthwaite had been like other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked, still in her imperious little Indian way. Martha began to rub her grate again. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," she said stoutly, "and she's Mr. Craven's. But I'm to do the housework up here and wait on you a bit. But you won't need much waiting on." "Who's going to dress me?" demanded Mary. Martha sat up on her heels again and stared. She spoke in broad Yorkshire in amazement. "Can I dress this'n?" she said. "What do you mean? I don't understand your language," said Mary. "I forgot," Martha said. "Mrs. Medlock told me I'd have to be careful or you wouldn't know what I was saying." "I mean, can't you put on your own clothes?" "No," answered Mary, quite indignantly. "I never did in my life. My ayah dressed me, of course." "Well," Martha said, evidently not in the least aware that she was impudent, "it's time they should learn. They cannot begin younger. It'll do thee good to wait on the sin a bit. My mother always said she couldn't see why grand people's children didn't turn out fair fools. What with nurses and being washed and dressed and took out to walk as if they were puppies." "It is different in India," said Mistress Mary disdainfully. She could scarcely stand this. But Martha was not at all crushed. "I can see it's different," she answered. She answered almost sympathetically. "I dare say it's because there's such a lot of blacks there instead of white people. When I heard you was coming from India, I thought you were one too." Mary sat up in bed, furious. What? What? You thought I was a native? You daughter of a pig. Martha stared and looked hot. "Who are you calling names?" she said. "You need me so vexed." "That's not the way for a young lady to talk. I've nothing against the blacks. When you read about them in tracts, they're always very religious. You always read as a black man and a brother, and I've never seen a black, and I was fair pleased to think I was going to see one close. When I come in to light your fire this morning, I crept up on your bed and pulled the cover back careful to look at you. And there you was, disappointedly. No more black than me, for all you're so yellow." Mary did not even try to control her rage and humiliation. "You thought I was a native, you dared. You don't know anything about natives. They're not people. They're servants who must salaam to you. You know nothing about India. You know nothing about anything." She was in such a rage and felt so helpless before the girl's simple stare, and somehow she suddenly felt so horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood and which understood her, that she threw herself face downward on the pillows and burst into passionate sobbing. She sobbed so unrestrainedly that good-natured Yorkshire Martha was a little frightened and quite sorry for her. She went to the bed and bent over her. You mustn't cry like that there," she begged. "You mustn't for sure. I didn't know you'd be vexed. I don't know anything about anything, just like you said. I beg your pardon, miss. Do stop crying." There was something comforting and really friendly in her queer Yorkshire speech and sturdy way which had a good effect on Mary. She gradually ceased crying and became quiet. Martha looked relieved. "It's time for thee to get up now," she said. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry the breakfast and tea and dinner to the room next to this. It's been made into a nursery for thee. I'll help thee on with thy clothes if they'll get out of bed. If the buttons are at the back, they cannot button them up themselves." When Mary at last decided to get up, the clothes Martha took from the wardrobe were not the ones she had worn when she arrived the night before with Mrs. Medlock. "Those are not mine," she said. "Mine are black." She looked the thick white wool coat and dress over, and added with cool approval, "Those are nicer than mine." "These are the ones that must put on," Martha answered. "Mr. Craven ordered Mrs. Medlock to get 'em in London. He said, 'I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul,' he said. 'It'll make the place sadder than it is. Put colour on her.' Mother, she said she knew what he meant. Mother always knows what a body means. She doesn't hold back with black herself." "I hate black things," said Mary. The dressing process was one which taught them both something. Martha had buttoned up her little sisters and brothers, but she had never seen a child who stood still and waited for another to do things for her, as if she had neither hands nor feet of her own. "Why doesn't they put on their own shoes?" she said, when Mary quietly held out her foot. "My ayah did it," answered Mary, staring. "It was the custom." She said that very often. It was the custom. The native servants were always saying it. If one told them to do a thing their ancestors had not done for 1,000 years, they gazed at one mildly and said, "It is not the custom," and one knew that it was the end of the matter. It had not been the custom that Mistress Mary should do anything but stand and allow herself to be dressed like a doll. But before she was ready for breakfast, she began to suspect that her life at Misselthwaite Manor would end by teaching her a number of things quite new to her. Things such as putting on her own shoes and stockings, and picking up things she let fall. If Martha had been a well-trained fine young lady's maid, she would have been more subservient and respectful, and would have known that it was her business to brush hair and button boots and pick things up and lay them away. She was, however, only an untrained Yorkshire rustic, who had been brought up in a moorland cottage with a swarm of little brothers and sisters, who had never dreamed of doing anything but waiting on themselves, and on the younger ones who are either babies in arms or just learning to totter about and tumble over things. If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk. But Mary only listened to her coldly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she was not at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, homely way, Mary began to notice what she was saying. "You should see 'em all," she said. "There's 12 of us, and my mother only gets 16 shillings a week. I can tell you my mother's put her to get porridge for 'em all. They tumble about on the moor and play there all day, and mother says a fair lot of moor fattens 'em. She says she believes they eat the grass as some of the wild ponies do. Our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he's got a young pony he calls his own." "Where did he get it?" asked Mary. "He found it on the moor with its mother when it was a little one, and he began to make friends with it and give it bits of bread and pluck young grass for it. And it got to like him, so it follows him about and lets him get on its back. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals like him." Mary had never possessed an animal pet of her own, and had always thought she should like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. When she went into the room which had been made into a nursery for her, she found that it was rather like the one she had slept in. It was not a child's room, but a grown-up person's room, with gloomy old pictures on the walls and heavy old oak chairs. A table in the centre was set with a good substantial breakfast, but she had always had a very small appetite, and she looked with something more than indifference at the first plate Martha set before her. "I don't want it," she said. "Thou doesn't want the porridge?" Martha exclaimed incredulously. "No. Thou doesn't know how good it is. Put a bit of treacle on it, or a bit of sugar." "I don't want it," repeated Mary. Said Martha. "I can't abide to see good victuals go to waste. If our children was at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes." "Why?" said Mary coldly. "Why?" echoed Martha. "Because they scarce even had their stomachs full in their lives. They're as hungry as young hawks and foxes." "I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary, with indifference of ignorance. Martha looked indignant. "Well, it would do thee good to try it. I can see that plain enough," she said outspokenly. "I've no patience with folk and sits and stares at good bread and meat. My word, don't I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane and the rest of 'em had what was under their pinafores." "Why don't you take it to them?" suggested Mary. "It's not mine," answered Martha stoutly, "and this isn't my day out. I get my day out once a month, same as the rest. Then I go home and clean up for mother and give her a day's rest." Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast and some marmalade. "You wrap up warm and run out and play, you," said Martha. "It'll do you good and give you some stomach for your meat." Mary went to the window. There were gardens and paths and big trees, but everything looked dull and wintry. Out? Why should it go out on a day like this? Well, if it doesn't go out, they'll have to stay in, and what has they got to do? Mary glanced about her. There was nothing to do. When Mrs. Medlock had prepared the nursery, she had not thought of amusement. Perhaps it would be better to go and see what the gardens were like. "Who will go with me?" she inquired. Martha stared. "You'll go by yourself," she answered. "You'll have to learn to play like other children does when they haven't got sisters and brothers. Our Dixon goes off on the moor by himself and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him and birds that come and eat out of his hand. However little there is to eat, he always saves a bit of his bread to coax his pets." It was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she was not aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there would not be ponies or sheep. They would be different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Martha found her coat and hat for her and a pair of stout little boots, and she showed her way downstairs. "If they goes around that way, they'll come to the gardens," she said, pointing to a gate in a wall of shrubbery. "There's lots of flowers in the summertime, but there's nothing blooming now." She seemed to hesitate a second before she added, "One of the gardens is locked up. No one has been in it for 10 years. "Why?" asked Mary, in spite of herself. Here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house. Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He wouldn't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. There's Mrs. Medlock's bell ringing. I must run. After she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. She could not help thinking about the garden which no one had been into for 10 years. She wondered what it would look like and whether there were any flowers still alive in it. When she had passed through the shrubbery gate, she found herself in the great gardens with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders. There were trees and flower beds and evergreens clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old grey fountain in the midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. This was not the garden which was shut up. How could a garden be shut up? You could always walk into a garden. She was just thinking this when she saw that, at the end of the path she was following, there seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She was not familiar enough with England to know she was coming upon the kitchen gardens where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went toward the wall and found there was a green door in the ivy and that it stood open. This was not the closed garden, evidently, and she could go into it. She went through the door and found it was a garden with walls all around it, and it was only one of several walled gardens which seemed to open into one another. She saw another open green door, revealing bushes and pathways between beds containing winter vegetables. Fruit trees were trained flat against the wall, and over some of the beds there were glass frames. The place was bare and ugly enough. Mary thought as she stood and stared about her. It might be nicer in summer when things were green, but there was nothing pretty about it now. Presently an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door leading from the second garden. He looked startled when he saw Mary and then touched his cap. He had a surly old face and did not seem at all pleased to see her, but then she was displeased with his garden and wore her quite contrary expression, and certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. "What is this place?" she asked. "One of the kitchen gardens," he answered. "What is that?" said Mary, pointing through the other green door. "Another of 'em," shortly. "There's another on the other side of the wall, and there's an orchard over the side of that." "Can I go in them?" asked Mary. "If the likes, but there's naught to see." Mary made no response. She went down the path and through the second green door. There she found more walls and winter vegetables and glass frames. But in the second wall there was another green door, and it was not open. Perhaps it led into the garden which no one had seen for 10 years. As she was not at all a timid child and always did what she wanted to do, Mary went to the green door and turned the handle. She hoped the door would not open because she wanted to be sure she found the mysterious garden. But it did open quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. There were walls all around it also, and trees trained against them. And there were bare fruit trees, growing in the winter brown grass. But there was no green door to be seen anywhere. Mary looked for it, and yet when she had entered the upper end of the garden, she noticed that the wall did not seem to end with the orchard, but to extend beyond it, as if it enclosed a place at the other side. She could see the tops of the trees above the wall, and when she stood still, she saw a bird with a bright red breast sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. She stopped and listened to him, and somehow his cheerful, friendly little whistle gave her a pleased feeling. Even a disagreeable little girl may be lonely, and the big closed house and big bare moor and big bare gardens had made this one feel as if there were no one left in the world but herself. If she had been an affectionate child who had been used to being loved, she would have quite broken her heart. And even though she was Mistress Mary quite contrary, she was desolate, and the bright-breasted little bird brought a look into her sour little face which was almost a smile. She listened to him until he flew away. He was not like an Indian bird, and she liked him and wondered if she should ever see him again. Perhaps he lived in the mysterious garden and knew all about it. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatever to do that she thought so much of the deserted garden. She was curious about it and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Craven buried the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She wondered if she should ever see him, but she knew that if she did, she should not like him, and he would not like her, and that she should only stand and stare at him and say nothing, though she should be wanting dreadfully to ask him why he'd ever done such a queer thing. People never like me, and I never like people, she thought. And I never can talk as the Crawford children could. They were always talking and laughing and making noises. She thought of the robin and of the way he seemed to sing his song at her, and she remembered the treetop he perched on as she stopped rather suddenly on the path. I believe that tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was, she said. There was a wall around the place and there was no door. She walked back into the first kitchen garden she had entered and found the old man digging there. She went and stood beside him and watched him a few moments in her cold little way. He took no notice of her, and so at last she spoke to him. I have been into the other gardens, she said. There was nothing to prevent thee, he answered crustily. I went into the orchard. There was no dog at the door to bite thee, he answered. There was no door there into the other garden, said Mary. What garden? He said in a rough voice, stopping his digging for a moment. The one on the other side of the wall, answered Mistress Mary. There are trees there. I saw the tops of them. A bird with a red breast was sitting on one of them, and he sang. To her surprise, the surly old weather-beaten face actually changed its expression. A slow smile spread over it, and the gardener looked quite different. It made her think that it was curious how much nicer a person looked when he smiled. She had not thought of it before. He turned about to the orchard side of his garden and began to whistle. A low, soft whistle. She could not understand how such a surly man could make such a coaxing sound. Almost the next moment, a wonderful thing happened. She heard a soft little rushing flight through the air, and it was the bird with the red breast flying to them, and he actually alighted on the big red clod of earth quite near to the gardener's foot. Here he is, chuckled the old man, and then he spoke to the bird as if he were speaking to a child. Where has there been, that cheeky little beggar? He said. I've not seen thee before today. Has there been the court in this early in the season? Thought too forward. The bird put his tiny head on one side and looked at him with a soft bright eye which was like a black dewdrop. He seemed quite familiar and not the least afraid. He hopped about and pecked the earth briskly, looking for seeds and insects. It actually gave Mary a queer feeling in her heart, because he was so pretty and cheerful and seemed so like a person. He had a tiny, plump body and a delicate beak and slender, delicate legs. Will he always come when you call him? She asked, almost in a whisper. Aye, that he will. I've known him ever since he was a fledgling. He came out of the nest with the other gardens, and when he first flew over the wall, he was too weak to fly back for a few days, and we got friendly. When he went back over the wall again, the rest of the brood was gone, and he was lonely, and he came back to me. What kind of bird is he? Mary asked. Doesn't thee know? He's a robin redbreast, and they're the friendliest, curiousest birds alive. They're almost as friendly as dogs if you know how to get on with them. Watch him pecking there, looking round at us now and again. He knows we're talking about him. It was the queerest thing in the world to see the old fellow. He looked at the plump little scarlet waistcoated bird, as if he were both proud and fond of him. He's a conceited one, he chuckled. He likes to hear folk talk about him, and curious, bless me, there was never his like for curiosity and meddling. He's always coming to see what I'm planting. He knows all the things Mr. Craven never troubles himself to find out. He's the head gardener, he is. The robin hopped about, busily pecking the soil, and now and then stopped and looked at them a little. Mary thought his black dewdrop eyes gazed at her with a great curiosity. It really seemed as if he were finding out all about her. The queer feeling in her heart increased. There's no knowing. The old ones turn him out of the nest and make him fly, and they've scattered before you know it. This one was a knowing one, and he knew he was lonely. Mistress Mary went a step nearer to the robin and looked at him very hard. I'm lonely, she said. She had not known before that this was one of the things which made her feel sour and cross. She seemed to find it out when the robin looked at her, and she looked at the robin. The old gardener pushed his cap back on his bald head and stared at her a minute. Art thou the little wench from India? He asked. Mary nodded. Then no wonder thou art lonely. That be lonelier before that's done, he said. He began to dig again, driving his spade deep into the rich black garden soil, while the robin hopped about, very busily employed. What is your name? Mary inquired. He stood up to answer her. Ben Weatherstaff, he answered, and then he added with a surly chuckle. I'm lonely myself, except when he's with me, and he jerked his thumb towards the robin. He's the only friend I've got. I have no friends at all, said Mary. I never had. My ayah didn't like me, and I never played with anyone. It is a Yorkshire habit to say what you think with blunt frankness, and old Ben Weatherstaff was a Yorkshire moorman. Thou and me, we're a good bit alike, he said. We was wove out of the same cloth. We're neither of us good looking, and we both of us as sour as we look. We've got the same nasty tempers, both of us, I'll warrant. This was plain speaking, and Mary Lennox had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Native servants always salaamed and submitted to you, whatever you did. She had never thought much about her looks, but she wondered if she was as unattractive as Ben Weatherstaff, and she also wondered if she looked as sour as he had looked before the robin came. She actually began to wonder also if she was nasty-tempered. She felt uncomfortable. Suddenly a clear rippling little sound broke out near her, and she turned around. She was standing a few feet from a young apple tree, and the robin had flown onto one of its branches, and it burst out into a scrap of song. Ben Weatherstaff laughed outright. What did he do that for? Asked Mary. He's made up his mind to make friends with thee, replied Ben. Dang me if he didn't took a fancy to thee. To me? Said Mary, and she moved towards the little tree softly and looked up. Would you make friends with me? She said to the robin, just as if she was speaking to a person. Would you? And she did not say it either in her hard little voice or her imperious Indian voice, but in a tone so soft and eager and coaxing that Ben Weatherstaff was as surprised as she had been when she heard him whistle. Why? He cried out. They said that as nice and human as if there was a real child instead of a sharp old woman. They said almost like Dickon talks to his wild things on the moor. Do you know Dickon? Mary asked, turning around rather in a hurry. Everybody knows him. Dickon's wandering about everywhere. The very blackberries and heatherbells knows him. I warrant the foxes shows him where their cubs lies, and skylarks don't hide their nests from him. Mary would have liked to ask some more questions. She was almost as curious about Dickon as she was about the deserted garden. But just that moment the robin, who had ended his song, gave a little shake of his wings, spread them, and flew away. He had made his visit and had some other things to do. He has flown over the wall, Mary cried out, watching him. He has flown into the orchard. He has flown across the other wall into the garden where there is no door. He lives there, said old Ben. He came out of the egg there. If he's caught in, he's making up to some young madam of a robin that lives among the old rose trees there. Rose trees, said Mary. Are they rose trees? Ben Weatherstaff took up his spade again and began to dig. There was 10 years ago, he mumbled. I would like to see them, said Mary. Where is the green door? There must be a door somewhere. Ben drove his spade deep and looked uncompanionable as he had looked when she first saw him. There was 10 years ago, but there isn't now, he said. No door, cried Mary. There must be. None as anyone can find, and none is in anyone's business. Don't you be meddlesome wench and poke your nose where it ain't no cause to go. Here I must go on with my work. Get you gone and play you. I've no more time. He actually stopped digging, threw his spade over his shoulder, and walked off without even glancing at her, or saying goodbye. Chapter 5. The Cry in the Corridor. At first, each day which passed by for Mary Lennox was exactly like the others. Every morning she awoke in her tapestried room and found Martha kneeling upon the hearth, building her fire. Every morning she ate her breakfast in the nursery, which had nothing amusing in it, and after each breakfast she gazed out of the window across to the huge moor, which seemed to spread out on all sides and climb up to the sky. And after she had stared for a while, she realized that if she did not go out, she would have to stay in and do nothing. And so she went out. She did not know that this was the best thing she could have done, and she did not know that, when she began to walk quickly or even run along the paths and down the avenue, she was stirring her slow blood and making herself stronger by fighting with the wind which swept down from the moor. She ran only to make herself warm, and she hated the wind which rushed at her face and roared and held her back, as if it were some giant she could not see. But the big breaths of rough, fresh air blown over the heather filled her lungs with something which was good for her whole thin body, and whipped some red color into her cheeks and brightened her dull eyes when she did not know anything about it. But after a few days spent almost entirely out of doors, she wakened one morning knowing what it was to be hungry, and when she sat down to her breakfast, she did not glance disdainfully at her porridge and push it away, but took up her spoon and began to eat it and went on eating it until her bowl was empty. "They got on well with that this morning, didn't they?" asked Martha. "It tastes nice today," said Mary, feeling a little surprised herself. "It's the air of the moor that's giving thee stomach for the victuals," answered Martha. "It's lucky for thee that there's got victuals as well as appetite. There's been 12 in our cottages had the stomach and nothing to put in it. You go and play in your out of doors every day and you'll get some flesh on your bones and you won't be so yellow." "Don't play," said Mary. "I have nothing to play with." "Nothing to play with," exclaimed Martha. "Our children plays with sticks and stones. They just runs about and shouts and looks at things." Mary did not shout, but she looked at things. There was nothing else to do. She walked round and round the gardens and wandered about the paths in the park. Sometimes she looked for Ben Weatherstaff, but though several times she saw him at work, he was too busy to look at her or was too surly. Once when she was walking toward him, he picked up his spade and turned away as if he did it on purpose. One place she went to oftener than to any other. It was the long walk outside the gardens with the walls round them. There were bare flower beds on either side of it, and against the walls ivy grew thickly. There was one part of the wall where the creeping dark green leaves were more bushy than elsewhere. It seemed as if for a long time that part had been neglected. The rest of it had been clipped and made to look neat, but at this lower end of the walk it had not been trimmed at all. A few days after she had talked to Ben Weatherstaff, Mary stopped to notice this, and wondered why it was so. She had just paused and was looking up at the long spray of ivy swinging in the wind, when she saw a gleam of scarlet and heard a brilliant chirp, and there, on the top of the wall, perched Ben Weatherstaff's robin redbreast, tilting forward to look at her with his small head on one side. "Oh, is it you? Is it you?" And it did not seem at all queer to her that she spoke to him as if she was sure he would understand and answer her. He did answer. He twittered and chirped and hopped along the wall as if he were telling her all sorts of things. It seemed to Mistress Mary as if she understood him too, though he was not speaking in words. It was as if he said, "Good morning. Isn't the wind nice? Isn't the sun nice? Isn't everything nice? Let us both chirp and hop and twitter. Come on, come on." Mary began to laugh, and as he hopped and took little flights along the wall, she ran after him. Poor little, thin, sallow, ugly Mary. She actually looked almost pretty for a moment. I like you, she cried out, pattering down the walk, and she chirped and tried to whistle, which last she did not know how to do in the least. But the robin seemed to be quite satisfied and chirped and whistled back at her. At last he spread his wings and made a darting flight to the top of a tree, where he perched and sang loudly. That reminded Mary of the first time she had seen him. He had been swinging on a treetop then, and she had been standing in the orchard. Now she was on the other side of the orchard and standing in the path outside a wall. Much lower down, and there was the same tree inside. It's in the garden no one can get into, she said to herself. It's the garden without a door. He lives in there. How I wish I could see what it is like. She ran up the walk to the green door, and she had entered the first morning. Then she ran down the path towards the other door and then into the orchard. And when she stood and looked up, there was a tree on the other side of the wall, and there was a robin just finishing his song and beginning to preen his feathers with his beak. It is the garden, she said. I'm sure it is. She walked around and looked closely at the other side of the orchard wall, but she only found what she had found before, that there was no door in it. Then she ran through the kitchen gardens again and out into the walk outside the long ivy-covered wall. And she walked to the end of it and looked at it, but there was no door. And then she walked to the other end, looking again, but there was no door. It's very queer, she said. Ben Weatherstaff said there was no door, and there is no door. But there must have been one 10 years ago, because Mr. Craven buried the key. This gave her so much to think about that she began to be quite interested, and feel that she was not sorry that she had come to Misselthwaite Manor. In India, she had always felt hot and too languid to care much about anything. The fact that the fresh wind from the moor had begun to blow the cobwebs out of her young brain and to waken her up a little. She stayed out of doors nearly all day, and when she sat down to her supper at night, she felt hungry and drowsy and comfortable. She did not feel cross when Martha chatted away. She felt as if she rather liked to hear her. And at last she thought she would ask a question. She asked it after she had finished her supper and sat down on the hearth rug before the fire. Why did Mr. Craven hate the garden? She said. She had made Martha stay with her, and Martha had not objected at all. She was very young and used to a crowded cottage full of brothers and sisters, and she found it dull in the great servants' hall downstairs, where the footmen and upper housemaids made fun of her Yorkshire speech and looked upon her as a common little thing, and sat and whispered among themselves. Martha liked to talk, and the strange child who had lived in India and had been waited upon by the blacks was novelty enough to attract her. She sat down on the hearth herself without waiting to be asked. After thinking about that garden yet, she said. I knew the wood. That was just the way with me when I first heard about it. Why did he hate it? Mary persisted. Martha tucked her feet under her and made herself quite comfortable. Listen to the wind wuthering around the house, she said. You would bear standing up on the moor if you were out on it tonight. Mary did not know what wuthering meant until she listened, and then she understood. It must mean that hollow, shuddering sort of roar which rushed around and around the house, as if the giant no one could see were buffeting it and breaking at the walls and windows to try to break in. But one knew he could not get in, and somehow it made one feel very safe and warm inside a room with a red coal fire. But why did he hate it so, she asked, after she had listened. She intended to know if Martha did. Then Martha gave up her store of knowledge. Mind, she said, Mrs. Medlock said it's not to be talked about. There's lots of things in this place that's not to be talked over. That's Mr. Craven's orders. His troubles are none servant's business, he says. But for the gardens, he wouldn't be like he is. It was Mrs. Craven's garden that she had made when first they were married, and she just loved it, and they used to tend the flowers themselves. And none of the gardeners was ever let to go in. Him and her used to go in and shut the door and stay there hours and hours reading and talking. And she was just a bit of a girl, and there was an old tree with a branch bent like a seat on it. And she made roses grow over it, and she used to sit there. But one day when she was so sitting there, a branch broke and she fell on the ground and was hurt. So bad that the next day she died. The doctors thought he'd go out of his mind and die too. That's why he hates it. No one's ever gone in since, and he won't let anyone talk about it. Mary did not ask any more questions. She looked at the red fire and listened to the wind wuthering. It seemed to be wuthering louder than ever. And that's where I think I'm going to call it a night. Reminder that, as usual, if you like what you've heard, you can pick up the book on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytimetales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Desire by Kumiko. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.